December 20th, 2016. A Tuesday morning in San Pablito, Tultepec, Mexico, a small municipality approximately 20 miles north of Mexico City. The town of Tultepec has a unique identity in Mexico. It's known as the pyrotechnic capital of the country, a place where fireworks aren't just sold but are woven into the very fabric of community life. For generations, families in this region have manufactured fireworks by hand, passing down techniques and traditions from parents to children. The craft defines the local economy, provides employment for thousands, and has made Tultepec famous throughout Mexico and beyond. At the heart of this fireworks culture sits the San Pablito Fireworks Market, a sprawling open-air bazaar containing approximately 300 wooden stalls packed tightly together, each one stocked floor to ceiling with pyrotechnics of every imaginable variety. Bottle rockets, Roman candles, aerial shells, sparklers, firecrackers, Catherine wheels, massive firework displays designed for festivals and celebrations. The market is the largest of its kind in Mexico, attracting buyers from across the country who come to purchase fireworks for Christmas, New Year's Eve, religious festivals, weddings, and countless other celebrations that Mexican culture marks with explosive color and sound. The timing is significant. December 20th falls in the heart of the Christmas shopping season. In just 5 days, Mexican families will celebrate Christmas Eve, Noche Buena, one of the most important celebrations of the year. Fireworks are an essential component of these festivities. The tradition of setting off fireworks during Christmas celebrations runs deep in Mexican culture, combining indigenous traditions with Catholic observances introduced during colonial times. For many families, purchasing fireworks for Christmas is as important as buying gifts or preparing traditional meals. This means that in the days leading up to December 24th, the San Pablito market experiences its highest traffic of the entire year. Thousands of shoppers crowd into the narrow pathways between stalls, browsing merchandise, negotiating prices, and purchasing bags and boxes full of fireworks to take home for the upcoming celebrations. On this particular Tuesday morning, the market is already bustling despite the early hour. Vendors have opened their stalls and are arranging their merchandise, creating colorful displays designed to attract customers. Shoppers are arriving, many of them families with children who are excited to see the vast array of fireworks available. The atmosphere is festive, filled with the sounds of vendors calling out to potential customers, children laughing and pointing at colorful packages, and the general buzz of a busy marketplace. The narrow walkways between stalls are becoming crowded as more people arrive. The market's layout is dense, with wooden stalls constructed very close together to maximize the number of vendors who can operate in the available space. The pathways between them are barely wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably, and when the market is busy, these passages become congested with shoppers moving in both directions, stopping to examine merchandise, and negotiating purchases. What nobody in the market that morning fully appreciates, or perhaps what they've become so accustomed to that they no longer consciously register it, is that they are standing in one of the most dangerous commercial spaces imaginable. The San Pablito market is essentially a massive powder keg, hundreds of wooden structures packed with tons of explosive materials, arranged with minimal spacing, operating with virtually no modern safety infrastructure, and filled with thousands of people including children. The market operates under regulations that are, on paper, supposed to ensure safety. There are rules about how fireworks should be stored, how much inventory each stall can hold, what types of construction materials should be used, and what safety equipment should be present. However, enforcement of these regulations has always been inconsistent at best. The economic importance of the fireworks industry to Tultepec creates pressure to allow the market to operate in ways that maximize business activity, even when doing so compromises safety. Many stall owners store far more inventory than regulations technically permit, because during peak seasons like Christmas, having large quantities of merchandise available is essential to maximizing sales. The construction of the stalls themselves presents fundamental fire hazards. Most are built primarily from wood, a material that's affordable and easy to work with but obviously combustible. The roofs are often made from sheet metal or corrugated materials that provide protection from weather, but do nothing to prevent fire spread and can actually channel heat and flames when fires occur. The close proximity of the stalls means that if one catches fire, flames can easily jump to adjacent structures within seconds. The market lacks the kind of fire suppression infrastructure that would be standard in commercial spaces in developed countries. There are no sprinkler systems, no fire-rated walls between stalls, inadequate fire extinguishers, and limited water access for firefighting. The narrow pathways that wind through the market would make it difficult for firefighters to move equipment quickly, even if they could respond immediately. And perhaps most critically, there is no effective way to quickly evacuate thousands of people from the market if an emergency occurs. The same narrow passages that make the market feel bustling and atmospheric during normal operations become potential death traps when people need to flee. This isn't the first time the San Pablito market has experienced disaster. In September 2005, 11 years before this December morning, the market was destroyed by a massive explosion and fire that killed at least 28 people and injured more than 70 others. In the aftermath, promises were made of improved safety measures, better regulation, and redesigned facilities. A new market was built to replace the destroyed one, and officials assured the public that lessons had been learned. However, the fundamental problems remained largely unchanged. The new market still consisted of wooden stalls packed closely together, still lacked comprehensive fire suppression systems, and vendors still stored large quantities of explosives in close proximity to each other and to customers. The economic incentives that drove unsafe practices remained exactly the same. The vendors and shoppers in the market on December 20, 2016 are aware of the risks at some level. Everyone in Tultepec knows about the 2005 disaster, but humans have a remarkable capacity to normalize risk, especially when economic survival depends on continuing activities that carry that risk. For the vendors, operating a fireworks stall is how they feed their families. The cognitive dissonance is resolved by fatalistic acceptance. Accidents happen. We've been doing this for generations. What else can we do? At approximately 9:15 a.m., something goes wrong in one of the stalls. The exact ignition source would never be definitively determined, but the most likely causes are familiar. A spark from static electricity. A cigarette despite regulations prohibiting smoking. Friction from moving inventory. An electrical short in makeshift wiring. A small firework that spontaneously ignited due to heat or instability. In an environment where tons of explosive materials are present and hundreds of potential ignition sources exist, ignition is almost inevitable. The initial fire is small, perhaps just a few fireworks beginning to burn or spark. But in the chaotic environment of a busy marketplace, those critical first seconds are lost. By the time anyone fully registers what's happening, the fire has already reached other fireworks in the stall. And once multiple fireworks are igniting, the situation escalates with terrifying speed. One firework ignites and its heat and sparks ignite others nearby. The heat builds, smoke fills the air, and then the first explosion occurs. A larger aerial shell, or a concentration of firecrackers, detonates with a blast that sends burning debris flying in all directions. That debris lands on other stalls, on merchandise displayed outside, on the wooden structures themselves. Within seconds, multiple stalls are burning. The people in the immediate vicinity have only seconds to react before they're engulfed by spreading flames and explosions. Some manage to turn and run. Others are knocked down by the blast wave. Still others, frozen by shock or confusion, don't move quickly enough, and are caught as fire spreads with impossible speed through the densely packed market. The sound of the first major explosions carries across the entire market and into surrounding streets. Everyone immediately knows what that sound means. The market is exploding. For the thousands of people still inside, this recognition triggers instant panic. The festive atmosphere transforms into terror. Parents grab children. Shoppers drop purchases and run. Vendors abandon their stalls and flee. Everyone is trying to reach the exits simultaneously, but the exits are few and the pathways are narrow and now filled with smoke, and people are falling and others are trampling over them in desperation to escape. The explosions are continuous now. Not a single blast, but a rolling, cascading series of detonations that seem to come from every direction. The fire spreads from stall to stall faster than people can run. Flames leap across the narrow gaps between structures. Burning debris flies through the air, landing on roofs, on merchandise, on people. The wooden stalls, dried by years of exposure to sun and heat, burn with frightening intensity. Within minutes, a significant portion of the market is fully engulfed, a roaring inferno punctuated by constant explosions as the inventory of fireworks in each stall cooks off. The explosions are not uniform. Small firecrackers create rapid-fire strings of popping sounds. Larger aerial shells detonate with massive concussive blasts that can be felt kilometers away. Roman candles shoot flaming projectiles in every direction. Rockets launch erratically, their propellant burning wildly, sending them careening through the smoke-filled air to impact buildings, people, vehicles. The overall effect is of being inside a war zone, with explosions, fire, smoke and debris creating an environment of absolute chaos, where survival is a matter of luck as much as anything else. For the emergency responders being alerted to the disaster, the initial reports are almost incomprehensible. Multiple calls are flooding into emergency dispatch. The San Pablito market is exploding. There are hundreds of people trapped inside. The entire market is on fire. Fire trucks and ambulances begin responding immediately, but as they approach Tultepec, the magnitude of what they're about to encounter becomes visible from kilometers away. A massive column of smoke rises above the town, punctuated by explosions that continue to erupt with horrifying regularity. The sound of the blasts carries for miles. When the first fire trucks arrive at the scene, firefighters are confronted with a situation that defies normal emergency response protocols. The market is not just burning, it's exploding continuously. Approaching the fire to deploy hoses means exposing firefighters to blast hazards from detonating fireworks. Debris is raining down across a wide area. Rockets and other projectiles are launching unpredictably in all directions. The heat from the fire is intense enough that it's dangerous to approach within dozens of meters. And perhaps most challenging, there are still people inside the market, trapped by fire and debris, screaming for help, but unreachable because the explosions make it suicidal to enter the area. Firefighters make the agonizing decision that they cannot immediately enter the market to search for survivors. The continuous explosions make it too dangerous. Instead, they establish a perimeter and begin deploying water from a distance, trying to prevent the fire from spreading to surrounding buildings while they wait for the fireworks to burn out. It's a calculated decision based on the reality that sending firefighters into an actively exploding market would likely result in dead firefighters without saving victims who are probably already deceased. But it's also a decision that means people who might have survived with immediate rescue are left to die while emergency responders stand at a distance, unable to help. The residents of the surrounding neighborhoods face their own terror. Burning debris is landing on roofs. Rockets are slamming into walls. The explosions are so powerful that windows are shattering and walls are cracking. Families evacuate their homes, running into the streets, trying to reach safety while the market behind them continues to explode. Some residents, despite the danger, run toward the market rather than away, trying to find family members who were shopping or working there. Maria Gonzalez, a mother of 3, had sent her 14-year-old daughter Carmen to the market that morning to buy sparklers for Christmas. When the explosions started, Maria ran toward the market screaming her daughter's name, fighting against the tide of people fleeing in the opposite direction. Police officers had to physically restrain her from running into the inferno. For approximately 30 minutes, from the initial ignition until the majority of fireworks have burned out or exploded, the San Pablito market is essentially a continuous explosion zone. Witnesses describe it as sounding like sustained artillery bombardment. The blasts are so frequent and so powerful that the ground shakes. Seismographs kilometers away register the explosions. Video footage captured by witnesses from a distance shows an apocalyptic scene, a vast area of flame and smoke, with constant flashes of explosions, debris flying into the air, and massive blasts that send shockwaves rippling through the smoke. One video, filmed from a nearby hillside, captured the moment when what appeared to be a storage container filled with aerial shells detonated simultaneously, creating a mushroom cloud that rose hundreds of feet into the air, eerily similar to footage of nuclear weapons tests, though on a smaller scale. As the fireworks gradually burn out and the frequency of explosions decreases, firefighters are finally able to approach and begin deploying water directly onto the burning structures. But by this point, the market has been essentially destroyed. What had been 300 stalls filled with merchandise and bustling with shoppers is now a burning wasteland of collapsed structures, twisted metal and smoldering debris. The wooden stalls have been reduced to ash and charred timbers. The close spacing that allowed fire to spread so rapidly means that almost nothing survived intact. The entire market complex is leveled. From above, drone footage would later show a perfect circular devastation pattern, like a bomb crater, with the epicenter at the stall where the fire began and destruction radiating outward in all directions. The real horror becomes apparent when firefighters and rescue workers are finally able to enter the destroyed market and begin searching for victims. Bodies are everywhere. Some victims are found at the exits, overcome by smoke or killed by explosions as they tried to flee. Others are found inside collapsed stall structures, where they were trapped when buildings came down around them, or where they had taken cover trying to escape the explosions and fire. Many of the bodies are burned beyond recognition. Some victims were essentially cremated by the intensity of the heat. Others were killed by blast trauma, their bodies torn apart by explosions. Still others died from smoke inhalation or from being crushed by collapsing structures or trampled in the panic. One particularly heartbreaking discovery was a mother and her two young children found huddled together in a corner, the mother's body curved protectively over the children in a final instinctive attempt to shield them from the flames. The process of recovering bodies and searching for survivors takes hours. Every piece of debris must be carefully moved because victims might be buried underneath. The destroyed market covers a large area, and the complete destruction of structures makes it difficult to even determine where stalls had been located, which complicates efforts to account for vendors who had been working there. The heat in the debris is so intense that workers can only operate for short periods before needing to retreat and rest. And throughout this process there's the constant danger of secondary explosions. Not all the fireworks have detonated. Some remain buried in the debris, unstable and at risk of exploding when disturbed or when exposed to air and heat. Bomb disposal experts are called in to identify and safely detonate or remove unexploded ordnance, a surreal task more commonly associated with war zones than civilian marketplaces. As the scope of the casualties becomes clear, the full magnitude of the disaster emerges. The death toll would eventually reach at least 42 people killed, with some reports suggesting the actual number might be higher because some victims were so completely destroyed by the explosions and fire that remains could not be definitively identified or recovered. More than 70 people were seriously injured, many with severe burns covering large portions of their bodies, blast injuries including ruptured eardrums and internal organ damage, crush injuries from collapsed structures or trampling, and smoke inhalation damage to their lungs. The injured were transported to hospitals across the region, overwhelming local medical facilities and requiring some victims to be transferred to Mexico City for specialized trauma and burn care. Among the dead were entire families. The Ramirez family, parents and 3 children aged 6, 9 and 11, had come to buy fireworks together and died together when the stall they were browsing in was consumed by the initial explosions. Vendor Jose Luis Mendoza, 52, had operated his stall for 23 years, following in his father's footsteps. His adult son worked the adjacent stall. Both were killed. Firefighter paramedic Ana Torres, 31, a first responder who arrived early and was helping evacuate victims when a massive secondary explosion occurred, was killed instantly by shrapnel from a detonating aerial shell. Her death particularly devastated the emergency response community, as she had been widely respected for her courage and compassion. 7-year-old Miguel Santos had begged his grandfather to take him to see the fireworks market. His grandfather, unable to resist the boy's enthusiasm, agreed. Both died in the fire. Miguel's body was found clutching a package of sparklers he had apparently grabbed as they tried to flee. The immediate aftermath of the disaster saw an outpouring of grief and rage from the community. Grief for the dead and injured, for the lives destroyed, for the trauma inflicted on survivors and witnesses, but also rage at the fact that this had happened again. Just 11 years after the 2005 disaster that killed 28 people, the same market had exploded again, this time killing even more. Outside the makeshift morgue where bodies were being identified, family members screamed at government officials who arrived to express condolences. "You killed them," shouted one man who had lost his wife and daughter. "You knew this could happen, and you did nothing." The anger was palpable and justified. The promises of improved safety made after 2005 had clearly been hollow. Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto visited the site and expressed condolences to the victims' families. He promised a thorough investigation and vowed that those responsible for safety failures would be held accountable. Government officials at various levels made statements about investigating what happened and ensuring it wouldn't happen again. But for many in Tultepec, these words rang hollow. They had heard similar promises after 2005, those promises hadn't prevented the 2016 disaster. Why should anyone believe that this time would be different? At a community meeting held 3 days after the disaster, city officials faced a hostile crowd of vendors, victims' families, and concerned residents. When the mayor attempted to outline plans for rebuilding with improved safety measures, he was shouted down. "Your safety measures killed 42 people." Someone screamed from the crowd. The meeting descended into chaos and had to be abandoned. The investigation into the disaster's cause confirmed what most people already knew. The market had been operating with inadequate safety measures, too much inventory stored too close together, insufficient fire suppression equipment, inadequate regulation and enforcement, the dense layout that allowed fire to spread catastrophically. Investigators found that some stalls had been storing up to 5 times the legal limit of explosives. Electrical wiring in many stalls was makeshift and dangerous, with exposed wires and overloaded circuits. The pathways between stalls, which regulations stipulated should be at least 3 meters wide to allow evacuation and firefighting access, were in many cases less than 1 meter wide because vendors had expanded their stalls illegally. Fire extinguishers that were supposed to be present at regular intervals throughout the market were either missing, empty, or had not been serviced in years. The investigation also noted that the December timing, when the market was at its most crowded and vendors had maximum inventory for the Christmas season, had maximized the casualties. Perhaps most damning was the revelation that municipal inspectors had visited the market just 2 weeks before the disaster. Their report, obtained by journalists and made public, noted numerous safety violations including blocked pathways, excessive inventory storage, and inadequate fire suppression equipment. The report recommended immediate corrective action and warned that the market presented significant fire risk. However, no enforcement action had been taken. The inspectors had filed their report with the municipal government, but no follow-up occurred. When questioned, city officials claimed they were developing a compliance plan and had intended to work with vendors to address the violations, but the disaster occurred before any action could be implemented. This revelation sparked particular outrage because it demonstrated that authorities had specific knowledge of dangerous conditions and had failed to act, making the disaster not just preventable in a general sense, but specifically preventable if the warnings in the inspection report had been heeded. In the months following the disaster, there were heated discussions about how to rebuild. Some argued the market should not be rebuilt at all, that the risk was simply too great, and that fireworks sales should be dispersed to multiple smaller locations that couldn't create mass casualty events if disasters occurred. Safety experts brought in from other countries recommended this approach, pointing out that no amount of safety improvements could eliminate the fundamental hazard of concentrating large quantities of explosives in a single location frequented by thousands of people. However, this recommendation faced fierce opposition from vendors whose livelihoods depended on the market and who argued that the concentrated market was economically essential. Dispersing sales across multiple locations would reduce customer traffic to each location, making it economically unviable for many vendors to continue operating. Others argued that the market could be rebuilt with genuine safety improvements that would reduce risk to acceptable levels. Concrete structures with significant separation between stalls, comprehensive sprinkler systems and water supplies, fire-rated walls and roofs that would contain fires and prevent them from spreading, wide pathways for evacuation and firefighting access, strictly enforced limits on inventory, mandatory training for vendors in fire safety and emergency response, electronic monitoring systems that would detect fires immediately and automatically alert emergency services. If implemented comprehensively, such measures could significantly reduce risk, though they could never eliminate it entirely. As long as tons of explosives are stored and sold in spaces where hundreds of people congregate, some level of risk is inherent. The reality that emerged was that comprehensive safety improvements were expensive, and the money to fund them was not readily available. Engineers estimated that rebuilding the market to international safety standards would cost approximately 50 million pesos, roughly $2.5 million. The municipal government's budget could not accommodate this expense without cutting other essential services. The state and federal governments were reluctant to provide funding, particularly given that similar markets existed throughout Mexico, and establishing a precedent of government-funded reconstruction would create expectations for support at other locations. The vendors who would need to rebuild their stalls had lost everything in the fire and lacked the capital to construct fire-resistant structures that would be truly safe. Some had insurance, but the policies covered only a fraction of their losses, and many vendors had been operating without insurance because premiums were expensive and profit margins were thin. A compromise solution eventually emerged. The market would be rebuilt with some safety improvements, but not the comprehensive measures that safety experts recommended. Stalls would be constructed with more spacing between them, though not as much as experts suggested. Some concrete barriers would be installed to help compartmentalize the market, but full fire-rated construction was deemed too expensive. The number of stalls would be reduced from 300 to approximately 200 to allow wider pathways. More fire extinguishers would be installed, and vendors would receive basic fire safety training. An improved alarm system would be installed. These measures represented genuine improvements over the pre-disaster conditions, but they fell far short of what would be required to prevent another catastrophic fire if one started. The fundamental hazard, hundreds of wooden and metal stalls stocked with tons of explosives in close proximity, remained. By December 2017, just 1 year after the disaster, the San Pablito market had been partially rebuilt and was operating again. Approximately 150 stalls had been reconstructed, and vendors were back in business, selling fireworks for the Christmas season just as they had the year before. The rebuilt market did feature the modest improvements that had been promised. Stalls were spaced further apart. There were more fire extinguishers. Some concrete barriers had been installed. The pathways were wider than before, though still narrower than safety experts had recommended. But fundamentally, it remained a market consisting of wooden and metal stalls packed with fireworks, serving large crowds during peak seasons. For the families of the 42 people killed in the disaster, the rapid reconstruction and reopening of the market was deeply painful. Many felt that their loved ones had been forgotten, that the promises of reform had been abandoned in favor of economic expediency, and that the community was setting itself up for another disaster. At the market's reopening ceremony, which was attended by government officials who praised the community's resilience and the vendors' determination to rebuild, a group of victims' families stood outside holding photographs of the dead and signs reading "Never Again" and 42 reasons to close this death trap. Their protests were largely ignored by officials and by media coverage that focused on the positive narrative of rebuilding and recovery. The December 2016 Tultepec disaster had one lasting impact beyond the local community. It brought international attention to the hazards of fireworks markets and similar facilities, where large quantities of explosives are stored and sold in proximity to populated areas. News coverage of the disaster, particularly the dramatic video footage of the continuous explosions, was broadcast globally. Fire safety experts and disaster researchers began using Tultepec as a case study in how not to manage explosive materials. Academic papers were published analyzing the disaster and its causes. The cascading nature of the explosions, where the initial fire triggered a chain reaction that destroyed the entire market within minutes, became a teaching example in courses on fire dynamics and emergency management. International organizations focused on fire safety used Tultepec to advocate for better regulations and enforcement regarding explosive storage and sales. The disaster contributed to ongoing efforts to develop international standards for fireworks markets, though implementation of such standards remains inconsistent globally. Some countries used the disaster as justification for strengthening their own regulations and closing facilities that were deemed unsafe. Others, facing similar economic and cultural pressures as Tultepec, made only minimal changes while hoping that disaster wouldn't strike their communities. The disaster also contributed to ongoing debates about whether cultural traditions can justify accepting higher levels of risk. Fireworks are deeply embedded not only in Mexican culture but in many cultures around the world. In China, India, Italy, Spain, the United States and countless other countries, fireworks are integral to celebrations and festivals. The visual spectacle, the noise, the excitement, these are valued components of how communities mark important occasions. But the Tultepec disaster, along with many other fireworks-related accidents and disasters globally, raises uncomfortable questions. How many deaths are acceptable as the price for maintaining traditions? At what point does cultural value become outweighed by safety concerns? There are no easy answers. Some argue that any tradition that causes deaths should be abandoned or severely restricted. Others argue that risk is inherent in human activity, and that completely eliminating all dangerous traditions would create a sanitized, risk-averse society that loses important cultural elements. The challenge is finding balance, ways to allow traditions to continue while implementing safety measures that reduce risk to levels most people would consider acceptable. But this requires honest assessment of risks, genuine commitment to implementing protective measures, and willingness to accept costs and inconveniences that safety requires. These conditions are often absent in communities where economic pressures are intense and resources are limited. For the survivors of the Tultepec disaster, both those who were physically injured and those who witnessed the horror but escaped physically unharmed, the trauma persists. Juan Herrera, a vendor whose stall was on the outer edge of the market and who escaped with minor burns, describes what he calls the sound. Whenever he hears fireworks now, even small ones at celebrations, his heart races and he experiences panic attacks. He hasn't been able to return to work at the rebuilt market despite financial pressure to do so. The thought of being surrounded by fireworks again triggers anxiety so severe that he becomes physically ill. His family has suffered economically because of his inability to work, creating additional stress and guilt. Rosa Martinez was shopping at the market with her mother when the explosions began. They became separated in the chaos. Rosa escaped through an exit, suffering smoke inhalation and minor burns. Her mother did not escape. Rosa found her mother's body 2 days later at the morgue, identified by jewelry that had survived the fire. Rosa describes being unable to sleep without seeing the flames, hearing the screams, and experiencing the moment when she realized her mother was not behind her, and she had to make the impossible choice of whether to go back into the inferno to search or to keep running to save herself. The guilt of having survived while her mother died consumes her. Children who witnessed the disaster or lost parents in it face developmental challenges and trauma that will shape their entire lives. Psychological studies of young survivors found high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety. Many children developed phobias not just of fire and fireworks but of crowds, of enclosed spaces, of loud noises of any kind. School performance declined among survivors as they struggled to concentrate while dealing with trauma. Some children regressed developmentally, exhibiting behaviors like bedwetting or separation anxiety that they had outgrown years earlier. The long-term psychological impact on these children represents a hidden toll of the disaster that extends far beyond the immediate casualties and will affect families for decades. The economic impact on families who lost primary breadwinners creates hardship that persists for years. Many of the vendors killed in the disaster had been the main source of income for extended families. With their deaths, entire families faced financial crisis. Some surviving family members attempted to rebuild stalls and continue the business, but many lacked the knowledge, connections, or capital to do so effectively. Widows and orphans faced poverty. The government provided some financial assistance to victims' families, but the amounts were modest and covered only immediate needs, not long-term support. International aid organizations provided some additional assistance, but funding was limited and not all families received help. Years after the disaster, many victims' families continue to struggle economically, compounding their emotional trauma with financial stress. The first responders who had to stand at a distance while people died inside the exploding market, then who had to search through the destroyed site, recovering horribly burned and mangled bodies, also carry psychological trauma. Firefighter Roberto Diaz, who was among the first to enter the destroyed market after the explosions subsided, describes the scene as like hell. The smell of burned flesh, the sight of bodies reduced to charred remains, the knowledge that some victims might have survived if responders had been able to enter earlier, these memories haunt him. Diaz took medical leave for 6 months after the disaster and underwent therapy for PTSD, but he says the memories never really fade. He returned to work eventually because firefighting is his career, and he feels obligation to serve his community, but he admits that every response to a fire now triggers anxiety that wasn't present before Tultepec. The December 20, 2016 disaster at the San Pablito market in Tultepec stands as one of the deadliest fireworks-related disasters in modern history. The death toll of 42 people and more than 70 seriously injured represents an immense tragedy for a small community. But beyond the statistics, the disaster represents a failure at multiple levels. It represents failed enforcement of existing regulations, failed learning from the 2005 disaster that should have prevented a recurrence, failed prioritization of safety over economic convenience, failed will to implement reforms that were expensive and disruptive but necessary, failed accountability for officials who knew about dangerous conditions and did nothing. The memorial erected at the site of the market features the names of the 42 victims inscribed on a stone monument. Fresh flowers are placed there regularly by families who have not forgotten and will never forget. The inscription reads "Para que nunca se repita," so that it never happens again. But whether that hope will be realized remains uncertain. The rebuilt market continues to operate with conditions that, while improved from the pre-disaster state, still present significant hazards. The economic and cultural factors that created the dangerous conditions in the first place have not fundamentally changed. Another disaster is not inevitable, but neither is it impossible. If there is any path toward redemption from the Tultepec tragedy, it lies in the possibility that other communities and countries might learn from Mexico's painful experience and implement preventive measures before their own disasters occur. International fire safety organizations have incorporated Tultepec into their training and advocacy, using it as an example of what happens when known hazards are not adequately addressed. Some jurisdictions have strengthened their regulations regarding explosive storage and sales in response to the disaster, but whether these efforts will be sufficient to prevent future tragedies elsewhere remains to be seen. The same pressures that led to the Tultepec disaster, economic necessity, cultural tradition, inadequate resources, weak enforcement, exist in communities around the world where similar hazards are present. The broader lesson extends to every situation where communities or organizations manage hazardous materials or activities. Risk assessment must be honest and comprehensive. Regulations must be enforced consistently. Economic pressures cannot be allowed to override safety requirements. Warnings must be heeded, and perhaps most importantly, near misses and previous disasters must be treated as opportunities to implement fundamental reforms, not as evidence that the situation is acceptable because it hasn't killed people recently. The 2005 Tultepec disaster should have prevented the 2016 disaster. It didn't because the lessons weren't genuinely learned, and the necessary changes weren't implemented. That failure cost 42 lives and caused immense suffering that persists to this day. The families of the victims, the survivors, and the community of Tultepec deserve more than the hollow promises and inadequate reforms that followed this disaster. They deserve genuine change that ensures their loved ones didn't die in vain, and that future generations won't experience similar tragedies. Whether they will receive that remains to be seen. The rebuilt market continues to operate. Vendors continue to sell fireworks. Shoppers continue to buy them, and the cycle continues. The hope is that the lessons learned written in the blood of 42 victims will finally be read and heeded not just in Tultepec but in every community facing similar hazards. That is the only meaningful way to honor those who died, and to prevent their deaths from becoming just another forgotten tragedy in the long history of preventable disasters.